Wow, we did it. We got here. We're at the end of adaptive organisation. Before your certificate, just some closing thoughts. And I'll start with a question for you. Not a full exercise, just a question. Who's invited? We've been thinking in this chapter about the conversations your organisation needs to have on how it organises. Well, who's invited? Who participates? Who participates in the survey if you're going to use the assessment tool? Who participates in the workshop or the workshops plural? When you have your next feedback opportunity, when you're celebrating your successes, accounting for the learning, well, who's telling those stories? Who's sharing? Who's participating in that? And who represents what? Who represents what scope, what scale, what space? Who represents what dimension of strategy or policy? Who represents the customer, who they are, where they are, what their needs are, when those needs arise? Who best represents each of those dimensions of the customer relationship? Who participates, who represents what, who's invited? I'll just leave that question with you. And let's look at adaptive organisation in the context of leading with outcomes as a whole. Now, for some of you, this is the fourth module of Leading with Outcomes. You've finished Leading with Outcomes, at least the core curriculum of Leading with Outcomes as a whole. And for you, a special congratulations. We do have more stuff coming from the Agendashift Academy, so watch this space for that. And in a moment, we'll look at the trainer and facilitator programs as well. If you've not completed the other modules, well, this is what you've got in store. Now, foundation and inside out together, those really do lay the platform, develop the skills, develop the fluency in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes. Developing and pursuing strategy in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes. The patterns of doing that and the directions of doing that, inside out and outside in. Inside out, starting with your experience, your capability, and working outwards to your impact. Or outside in, starting with your customer and their needs, your relationship with the customer, your relationship with your suppliers, with your competitors, and working your way into the implications of all of that for you as an organisation, for your teams, for your products, and so on. So that is leading with outcomes as a whole. As I mentioned, trainer and facilitator programs. Take facilitator first. That gives you access to workshop materials, the discovery workshop, the assessment debrief workshop, and you can use that with all of the assessment tools which will be available for you to use, and the outside-in strategy review workshop. And the trainer program, authorised trainer, that gives you access, of course, to the materials of the 4 modules. So that's a trainer and facilitator programs. Just get in touch if those could be of interest to you. So lastly, my own thoughts on the deliberately adaptive organisation here as a fresh take on the viable system model. You know, we've been drawing on knowledge developed over a number of decades. Some of it decades old, some of it a lot more recent. And I really wanted to take a 21st century perspective on all of that. And there's some things, therefore, that I have really carefully sought to emphasise, and it's time now for me to come clean on those. First of all, I have really emphasised something beautiful, and that is mutual relationships. More, in fact, than the systems. The systems just have to be there, but the mutual relationships. And that helps us access so many more kinds of knowledge and theory as we think about how those relationships work or don't work. Not just the traditional tools of cybernetics, but things like psychology, human psychology, organizational psychology, social psychology, things like queuing theory that is used by Lean and Lean Agile. And it's a two-way street, as we saw in Chapter 4, when you look at some of the hardest problems of process and of flow, and where the queuing theory is no longer solving your problems for you. Looking at the relationships involved can be really powerful. It's one of those things like flow that once you learn to see it, you can't unsee it. Another beautiful thing, autonomy, and with it, interdependence. I say that very carefully, interdependence. I am fundamentally committed to autonomy, as were the original pioneers of the viable system model. But there's a danger here. There's a danger that we start with our independent existence. Very often the viable system model treatments of it start with the organisation's independent existence. That is a fiction and a distraction, and modern developments like outsourcing and the virtual firm kind of render it moot anyway. We are interdependent. If you want a better starting point for autonomy, it is not interdependence, it's your capacity for independent action. That's where I started at the beginning with those words from John Boyd. So interdependence, which is autonomy with relationship. Then complexity. Got lots of things, lots of entities, lots of people, lots of pieces of work, lots of systems, lots of spaces, scopes, all these different things that we've talked about. As those numbers of things increase, so the issue of complexity becomes more and more important, to the point that it dominates. But as we saw in chapter 4, complexity as well can be a beautiful thing, certainly a good thing. Complexity that is a good fit for its environment is actually what you need, not a curse. And I've sought to use complexity style language and some of the tools of complexity again from early on, from chapter 1. Then networked, circular and dynamic. Now this is a question or an issue of historical context. If you go back to the source material, remember we're going back to the 70s and some of the things that led to that work done in the 70s, you'd be forgiven for thinking that all organisations were hierarchical. All the examples seem hierarchical, and despite the protestations that the model itself isn't hierarchical, and that's completely true and completely fair, given all those examples, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's a tool for hierarchy. And I have counterbalanced that by emphasising networks, circular organisation, and the need for dynamism. Dynamism where it's relatively easy at team level, dynamism where it's more difficult at other scales. And then spaces, scopes and scales, perhaps the most innovative part of the deliberately adaptive organisation. What it is a 10,000 foot view on the viable system model. We're hiding the details until we're ready to look at it. But it does some interesting things. Remember, right back to the introduction, we talked meaningfully, we told stories about that three-way relationship between delivery, discovery, renewal, adaptive strategy, and mutual trust building. That's an interesting dynamic. Those are interesting relationships, even before we drill down into the detail. And then perhaps its most valuable contribution is the way it exposes that four-ply relationship between different scales. And speaking to the Lean Agile community, of which I am a member, there's a lot of focus now on scaling, but it's mainly process-driven and to an extent structural, with very little theory of scaling, very little theory of organisation. There is a very real risk that all you're going to do is make things bigger, more complicated, and a worse fit for your host environment if you don't pay attention to the theory. As a community, we should be doing better. We need to be doing better. If you're part of that, if these issues affect you, then help me get that message out. Integration, in a few senses, there's the integration in the first of all in the sense that we've integrated a number of different bodies of knowledge, number of different models, number of different theories, and so on. Now, if you've read any of my books, you know that's just what I do. It's how I work. But I do think the framework of the deliberately adaptive organisation and the underlying theory of the viable system model both lend themselves very well to doing that. And then there's integration in that wholehearted sense, a better integrated, more whole organisation, one where more people are participating in the strategy process. There is more participation happening in those relationships between scales. And then we get to things like dialogic and generative conversations, things that are compatible with, sympathetic with the socially constructed organisation. And that leads us to start where you are, something positive, optimistic and highly practical. Start where you are in your scope or your multiple scopes. Start with your relationships, your networks, your personal networks of which you are at the centre, the networks of your scopes, and use every opportunity those relationships and those networks afford you. Start where you are. And where others around you are starting where they are, that's when the fun starts. That's where things are changing around you. And you will find that supports you, that helps you in your own efforts for change rather than making it more difficult. Start where you are and encourage others to start where they are too. So I will leave that there. It comes now to your certificate. Just complete the assessment in the post after this one, and we'll send you your certificate within the next working day, usually much quicker than that. If you share your certificate, do tag me, Mike Burrows, and or the Agendashift Academy. And that aside, it just leaves me to say thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your study. And it's been my privilege and honour to share this with you. Thank you.